Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar. ICCR is pleased to host this webinar for Majority Action on the mitigation of systemic climate risk by institutional investors, proxy voting for a 1.5 degree world. My name is Christina Herman and I coordinate the climate work of investors at the Interface Center on Corporate Responsibility. I think we'll give folks a few minutes to join the webinar. I can see people joining. We'll wait just a minute. So I think folks are still joining, but I think we'll get started. So I said earlier, for anyone who just joined, welcome. And just to say we're pleased, ICCR is pleased to host this webinar for Majority Action on the mitigation of systemic climate risk by institutional investors, proxy voting for a 1.5 degree world. My name is Christina Herman. I coordinate the climate work of investors at the Interface Center on Corporate Responsibility, of which Majority Action is a member. So before I turn the webinar over to the staff at Majority Action, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to all registrants later. And we'll also make a public link available in case you want to share it. The webinar will last for 45 minutes. Following the presentation, there will be time for Q&A within that 45 minutes. So please put your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the webinar. You can find that at the bottom of your screen, a little Q&A icon. And now I'll turn the floor over to Lisa Lindsley with Majority Action to get us started.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thanks very much to ICCR for hosting us today. We're so pleased to have this opportunity to present to our fellow ICCR members and to share with you the tool that we've developed after 18 months of research and intensive dialogue with asset owners and asset managers. And we're calling it Proxy Voting for a 1.5 degree world. The entire guide with voting recommendations, with sectoral analysis of the electric power, oil and gas, automotive, and finance sectors is available at proxyvoting.majorityaction.us. And we hope that, that you'll take a look around it. There seems to be a consensus that climate risk is systemic risk. And so we're moving beyond voting on one-by-one companies and the risk of that company's behavior to that company's value for investors and looking at a systemic level. So I won't take up time here making that case because many experts have already made it. But feel free to contact me if you'd like to discuss further that those arguments and the evidence in favor of it. Leading investors have come to the consensus that they cannot continue to ratify board leadership at companies in climate critical sectors that are failing to modify their behavior to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the Proxy Voting for 1.5 degrees website pulls together a preponderance of evidence and applies a rules-based approach to make recommendations on votes against directors in the climate critical industries of oil and gas, electric power, and banks. We also evaluate the automotive sector, but this year we are not making any recommendations against directors in that sector. After we review the metrics we applied, we will show you our list of recommendations, which are in most cases votes against the board leadership, chairs of the board, and if the chair is not independent, also the lead independent director. And as companies adopt new policies and make new disclosures and hopefully make a lot of progress towards the 1.5 degree pathway, we will be continuously updating our website and our recommendations to reflect that. So 3 states, Illinois, Vermont, and Connecticut, worked with us to adopt new proxy voting policies, joining leading asset owners like New York State and CalPERS, and asset managers like LGIM and BNP Paribas. Our team would be pleased to have individual conversations with ICCR members about the process of modifying their policies. And we're collaborating with this initial group of large asset owners, Connecticut, Vermont, and Illinois, on our recommendations about directors. And as you can see from the language that the Connecticut pension adopted, we're calling it enabling legislation, which means that it's not obliging, it's not obligating the fund to vote against directors, but it is enabling them to vote against directors. So I'm going to turn it over to the research director of Majority Action, Jessie Giles, and she is going to review the criteria and the data that we applied.
Sure. So as Lisa said, the goal of this project is to enable investors to hold boards accountable at companies that are climate critical and are thus far failing to realign their business models with the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so we looked at those industries that we believe are particularly critical for the net zero transition, those being power generation, oil and gas, automotive manufacturing, and financial services. And for each, we really tried to narrow in on what are the key components of net zero targeting and business realignment that we would want to see from companies in order to have confidence as investors that they were on the right pathway in terms of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So, for example, in the power generation sector, we looked at the targets that had been announced by different utilities. As I'm sure you're all aware, net zero targets come in lots of different varieties and lots of different qualities. And so we looked at whether or not those targets covered all the major business segments of the company, whether they had interim targets that were ambitious and aggressive enough to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and whether those targets forecast a really limited or substantial use of offsets or unproven technologies as a measure of how serious the utility was in making the near-term shifts that would be required to be aligned with a net zero transition. We also looked at certain aspects of their capital allocation plans and plans to phase out fossil fuel generation. And we looked at their policy influence activities. And you can see on these slides as we go through each industry, where possible, we have also tried to align these indicators and the metrics that we're using here with the information that is also available in the Climate Action 100 Plus benchmarking project. Most of the companies that we reviewed are also Climate Action 100 target companies. And so there's a real wealth of information as well available through their benchmarking project as well. So that's power generation. Some of you may have already seen our exempt solicitation filed at Duke Energy last week, where we are recommending against lead independent director Michael Browning and Chair Lynn Good on the basis of their failure to, as a company, to fully realign their business with meeting both the net zero target that they have announced and with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. In the oil and gas sector, very similar set of criteria. The main difference is that there are very few companies in the oil and gas sector that are even having the same conversation around net zero targeting. The only US-based oil and gas company that has made any type of commitment in this area is Occidental. And of course, at this stage, they are not planning on phasing out their fossil fuel production, but are relying very heavily on offsets and carbon removal technology to meet those targets, which we can consider to be insufficient. We'll also be filing company-specific proxy memos with the SEC with respect to Valero and Marathon Petroleum today, hopefully, maybe tomorrow, which will circulate. And as I mentioned, the criteria here are very similar. We're looking at the quality of those targets. What are their capital allocation plans, and are those plans designed to meet those targets? And then what kinds of policy influence activities are the companies undertaking, and are they in fact aligned with the type of activity we need to see? In the automotive sector, we have looked at both, some companies have net zero targets, others have timelines for the phase out of fossil fuel vehicles. We've also looked at policy influence activity and capital allocation in these sectors. As Lisa mentioned, we're not this year recommending against any companies in the automotive sector. What I want to say about that is just that just because a company is not one where we've made a firm recommendation against a director on the board does not mean that we think that that company is necessarily perfect in every single way. Every company that is in a climate critical industry has a way to go in terms of fully transforming their business to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. But it just means that at this point we're not making those recommendations in the automotive sector. In the financial services sector, we looked at the net zero financed emissions targets that banks are coming out with, looked at, again, how they are measuring and disclosing their climate impact and how they're using those disclosures to set interim targets and put themselves on a pathway to that net zero by 2050. And then we also looked at what are their near-term fossil fuel exclusion policies and whether those exclusion policies are aligned with the type of shift that we would need to see in financing, particularly for fossil fuel intensive projects and companies in coal mining, coal power production, Arctic oil and gas, and tar sands oil and gas. And you would have also seen, we would file an exempt solicitation with Wells Fargo earlier this week that lays out some of that with respect to that particular bank.
So here is the list of companies at which we are recommending votes against directors. And I believe Jesse will also be filing some solicitations today or tomorrow regarding Goldman Sachs and Berkshire Hathaway. Is that right? Okay.
That's right.
So in most cases, as I mentioned, the recommendation is against the chair of the board, and if the chair is not independent, against the lead independent director. There are a couple companies that still have classified boards, so those directors are not up for election, or as in the case of Berkshire Hathaway, there is no lead independent director, there's only Warren Buffett. So we are recommending against him. And I put the link here to our website, which we'll show you in just a minute. And you can see the full analysis of all of the aspects, the target setting, capital allocation and investment, and the policy influence for each of these companies. And as we mentioned, we've already filed exempt solicitations with the SEC on Duke and Wells Fargo. We'll be filing 3 or 4 more in the next couple of days, and with the intention of filing for every one of these companies, and really just demonstrating how they match up to the metrics and the decision points that are laid out on our website. And so the website again is proxyvoting.majorityaction.us, and I will see if we have any, right, and so as people are putting their questions in, we will just show you around that website a little bit so that you are able to see it. And because it can be updated we really encourage people to use this as a resource. So I will start out just looking at, so the very first page is this blue page. And then if you click on Proxy Voting Guide, you can see the list of directors and the AGM dates by sector. We'll also be linking to the exempt solicitations as we file them. So you can see, for example, the Wells Fargo exempt solicitation. And then if you click on the sector, the sector tabs, so you'll see what the overall set of metrics is for the sector, which Jesse has just summarized, and then there are links, hyperlinks that are quite helpful to all of the the preponderance of external resources that establish this framework. And then again, there's the analysis of each company. So this is the analysis of Duke, which justifies the voting recommendation. So the same is true for the oil and gas sector, the different analysis, and for the banks and the automotive sector. You can see on Wells Fargo all of the analysis there. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then we can do some questions and answers. All right, so I'll just read the question. So there's a question about how majority action is publicizing this to companies. Thank you for that question, Patricia. Our philosophy around proxy voting for 1.5 degrees is that shareholders have been in dialogue with companies and engaging companies, and there have been significant gains as a result of that process. And at the same time, the climate crisis is escalating, and companies have had the advantage of being able to proffer and frame their commitments on their own terms instead of taking a sectoral approach. So we're trying to put all the companies on the same footing in the same sector and draw bright lines and provide the evidence that shareholders need to fulfill their fiduciary duty and vote against directors. And we believe that in doing this, companies will be put on notice, but we are not, we as an organization do not have the capacity to pursue prolonged engagement with each company on this list, nor do we believe that it would be appropriate for us to do so, because we think that this is evidence-based. It didn't come from us. We put it together and did the analysis and are making recommendations. I don't know, Jesse, do you want to add anything to that?
The only thing I'd add is that all of the companies on this list have been the subject of extensive engagement from investors over a number of years around their management of climate risk. And there shouldn't really be anything in here that should come as a surprise to any of the companies that are involved here. As I mentioned, we do rely heavily for those companies that are Climate Action 100 plus companies on the assessments made in those benchmarks, which companies were given a chance to respond to those as that organization put together those benchmarks as well. So we think there's been ample time for companies to get their heads around the demands that investors are making on this front, and that, as Lisa said, as the crisis escalates, the time for discussion is coming to a close, and the time for action is really beginning.
Right. So the next question is about asset managers such as Blackrock and the extent to which we have engaged with them. I think you all know that we have published for the last at least 3 years, I think more, an analysis, and Jesse is actually the primary author of that, an analysis of how large asset managers have voted in the proxy season. And our reports, which we call Climate in the Boardroom, come out in September because the NPX filings are done at the end of August. So be on the lookout for that. And yes, we have communicated how we are approaching these votes to asset managers through various means of communication. And we are open to having discussions with them. We obviously do not, we really feel like this is the year of the test to see if the large asset managers like Blackrock are serious about voting against directors, or if they are just saying what they think people want to hear. And Jesse, do you want to take the next question about utilities and speak to why Dominion is not on our list?
Yeah, so I think in general, you're absolutely right. It is a substantial source of emissions for a number of utilities that have both gas distribution and electricity production businesses. We have looked at that in the context of the targets that they are setting and whether the utilities have included those business segments in their targets. And we would expect to incorporate more around both their capital allocation on that side of the business and their policy influence activities in that area in future years. In terms of Dominion specifically, there was a sense that given the changing political and policy environment that they were operating in Virginia and the changes to the board that are happening there at the moment, that we would keep them on watch. But I wouldn't say that we think that they're necessarily doing the best job either. I think this is what I was alluding to what I was saying before. Just because a company is not one that we're making a firm recommendation against does not mean that we think that they're fully aligned or that they are doing everything that they could be, and we expect to be continuing to escalate that pressure on those companies in future years. And certainly investors should feel free to make cases around companies like Dominion if they believe it's warranted. There's certainly a case to be made there as well.
I'm just gonna drop in the link to the site and encourage people to go there and also feel free to email us if you have any questions, once you're able to take a look at the site. And Christina, it seems like we don't have any more questions right now.
Yes, thanks. So I turned off my video. I'm not sure how to turn it back on again.
You're back on video.
Oh, I am. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you very much. That's really an amazing amount of work and very timely and helpful work for investors. So we hope everyone goes to the site, reads the proxy memos. They're really compelling. And yeah, if you have any last minute questions, just please pop them in the Q&A box. I just want to give a warm thanks to Majority Action for this campaign and for all your work and for sharing it with us.
And Christina, what's the best way for us to make sure that interested ICCR members receive the exempt solicitations as they're filed?
Well, we can easily put out a link to your website, and I presume you're posting them there. But we also have, on the ICCR site, Julie Walkety's been posting exempt solicitations to a page, and you can find that by going on our homepage. If you go over to the right, you can see a box that I think I forget exactly what it's called, but you'll be able to find it pretty easily. It's 2021 proxy memos and exempt solicitations. So if you just click there, it'll take you to a page where they're all listed. So as you file them, and this goes for any investors on the call as well, as you file any exempt solicitations, please send them to Julie, and you can send them to me. And I'll pop my email in the chat as well.
So Rob Barrage has just asked an excellent question about how success will be judged. And this is, this is the inaugural year of proxy voting for 1.5 degrees. And I think that we will be judging, as I mentioned, we'll be judging the performance of asset managers and watching them closely on how they vote. I think that we're really it's a new muscle. Voting against directors on the basis of climate risk and systemic risk is a new muscle for many asset owners, and we are getting them used to that and really normalizing the boardroom accountability that's needed to get back on a 1.5 degree pathway. So I think it would be a mistake to set the expectation that in 2021 there will be gigantic votes against directors at every single company. But we do know, and academic research has shown, that even small votes against directors have a huge impact. These titans of industry take votes against them personally, whereas they may not do so in the case of a shareholder proposal that asks for greater disclosure. Not that that's not a good thing to do. And in the case of Duke Energy, where the lead independent director, Michael Browning, has been on the board for, is it 31 years, Jesse? Has been on the board for 31 years. Even though the company is misleading, has changed its disclosure from its 2014 proxy, where it disclosed the correct amount of years, to its 2015 proxy, when it began to disclose a lower number of years. We do have a target for a double-digit vote against Michael Browning, because we're at a loss to understand how any investor could continue to vote for this lead independent director who's been at a company for 31 years. We have a question from John Huppner of LGIM, whose thought leadership we are very appreciative of. And the question is about the relationship between proxy voting for 1.5 degrees and shareholder proposals that ask companies to institute a say on climate. And our approach to that is, and I'm strictly speaking here about the US publicly traded equities market, which is the universe in which Majority Action operates. Our perspective is that I was at AFSCME after Rich Verlato pioneered and really did a lot of work to get Say on Pay instituted, and unfortunately that has not had the intended impact, and we fear that the same may be true for Say on Climate in the US. And there could be a structure within which you have a say on climate. You have to vote to get the say on climate instituted. Then you have to have a say on climate vote. So you're already at 2 years. And then you could have a third year in which the company got a bad vote. And so you start to vote against directors. But like, I think our recommendation is that you just skip all that and go right to voting against directors at companies that are not making progress on climate. And it's not that we don't have enough information. We are not lacking, we are no longer lacking in information about what companies need to be doing and what companies are doing. And that is one of the things that our website does, is it pulls together all of that external data on what companies need to be doing, what they are doing, and makes recommendations. And so the kind of shorthand we've been using, is that say on climate would be de-escalatory, and in a moment where escalation is clearly called for. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, I'd just like to weigh in and say that it is really urgent to take strong action now, because we are out of time on the climate crisis. And I think that's something that we keep reminding ourselves of, and keep saying to the world, that it's companies need to move very, very rapidly. We have 10 years or less, 9 years now, to decarbonize. So we just don't have the time and as John points out, it's good to do both, to have investors be, weighing in and talking to companies about their decarbonization plans and having a say on that, but really using this other spur to shift to rapid, deep decarbonization plans is really, we think, is very important. So.
Jesse, do you want to answer the question that we got about the most difficult part of the analysis?
Sure. I think that as there are a lot of organizations trying to do this assessment of company statements and of company commitments in a context where companies are making commitments and setting aspirational goals for 30 years in the future. And I think the real challenge for investors and for everyone watching these companies and trying to hold them accountable is, what are they doing right now? What are they doing in the next 12 months? What are they committing to do in the real near term that would make those goals feel like they were real goals and not just a press release? And I think that is the toughest challenge for all of us in assessing the commitments that these companies are making. We've tried to do that by looking specifically at the capital allocation plans that are in the near term, particularly for these industries that the investments they make today are going to be in operation for decades to come. And so we feel like that is a really critical component. And of course, the other one that I highlighted before was around their policy influence activities, which, again, we firmly believe that it is both in companies' interest and in investors' interest to act unilaterally and to act without needing substantial change from the government. That there are things companies can do now and can do today and should do today. And the putting in place of constructive policy settings to accelerate decarbonization, to ensure things like a just transition, to ensure that we're both acting with ambition and compassion to communities and in a consultative way. All of that requires constructive policy settings. And so that's one of the other reasons that we wanted to lift that up in a lot of cases. But certainly the most challenging part of this is figuring out what are those near-term actions that companies are taking that can demonstrate to investors and others in the community that they are serious about their net zero targets and that they're putting themselves on a pathway that would both allow them to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and meet their own commitments that they're making to investors and to communities.
I also wanted to point out that as an organization that believes that there is no logic that the conversion away from fossil fuels needs to land on the back of poorly paid workers, or that such a transition should come at a cost of furthering harm to communities of color and low-income communities. We are watching keenly and participating in the great leadership that ICCR has shown in the just transition, and studying metrics. I think Christina sent some around today that are being developed, and with an eye to hopefully being able to incorporate such an analysis into our recommendations in future years.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you mentioned the just transition, because it's harder to measure and have clear, as you say, bright lines, but very, very important. So we'll look forward to seeing that incorporated into your analysis. If there are no further questions, I wondered, is there anything else you wanted to share about the campaign? I just want to give my thanks again to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So we will be, as we said, we will be filing exempt solicitations on every single one of these. Most of them will be quite short, and we'll have a framing of the table as I showed on our Wells Fargo solicitation of how the company meets up with the metrics. And we hope that those will be tools that ICCR members can use when they're casting votes. And will be definitely available for any ICCR member who would like to have an individual meeting with us to further discuss what their thoughts are around the approach to board accountability and climate risk.
Great. Well, thanks very much. I think we'll hand people back a few minutes of their day, but really great to have you, and a terrific presentation. And again, terrific work. Congratulations.
Thank you. We really appreciate the opportunity.
Great. Thanks. Be well.
Bye.